So today I'm going to be sharing my thoughts on a debate between um, Jordan Peterson and this Slovenian, I don't know, communist, very renowned, well-known guy.
It doesn't seem to me that either Marx or Engels grappled with with this particular fundamental truth, which is that almost all ideas are wrong. And so, and it doesn't matter if they're your ideas or someone else's ideas, they're probably wrong. And even if they strike you with the force of brilliance, your job is to assume, first of all, that they're probably wrong, and then to assault them with everything you have in your arsenal and see if they can survive. And what struck me about the Communist Manifesto was it was akin to something Jung said about typical thinking. And this was the thinking of people who weren't trained to think. He said that the typical thinker has a thought, it appears to them like an object might appear in a room. The thought appears, and then they just accept it as true. They don't go the second step, which is to think about the thinking. And that's the real essence of critical thinking. And so,
So, um, an interesting opening statement by Peterson. I'm not even going to address the substance of it. I just think it's the wrong tack. They're debating capitalism versus socialism. So, um, I don't think necessarily dissecting the Communist Manifesto um, is really all that relevant when you could be looking at um, how socialism has been implemented, how capitalism has been implemented. You look at the real world, you can look at history. Um, I don't know anything about Zizek and his positions, but he might not be even a Marxist. So he could just be a communist. Uh, but I think it's definitely very interesting the way Peterson goes about it. And the things he says in the intro are interesting. I just think it's the wrong approach to take in a debate on capitalism versus socialism.
what would you call, guilty of that particular sin. So, here's proposition number one. History is to be viewed primarily as an economic class struggle. All right, so let's think about that for a minute. First of all, the proposition there is that history is primarily to be viewed through an economic lens, and I think that's a debatable proposition because there are many other motivations that drive human beings than economics, and those have to be taken into account, especially that drive people other than economic competition, like economic cooperation, for example. And so that's a problem. The other problem is that it's actually not nearly a pessimistic enough description of the actual problem, because history, this is to give the devil his due. The idea that one of the driving forces between history is hierarchical struggle is absolutely true. But the idea that that's actually history is not true, because it's deeper than history. It's biology itself, because organisms of all sorts organize themselves into hierarchies. And one of the problems with hierarchies is that they tend to arrange themselves into a winner-take-all situation. And so, that is implicit in some sense in Marx's thinking, because of course Marx believed that in a capitalist society, capital would accumulate in the hands of fewer and fewer people. And that actually is in keeping with the nature of hierarchical organizations. Now, the problem with that isn't so much the fact of there's
Peterson here sort of bending over backwards to rationalize the Marxist point of view. I think that the real counter is history is ultimately about ideas, not about material conditions. Um, Certainly, the notion of the Hegelian dialectic, um, that history is shaped by material conditions, and that there are inexorable laws governing the way that society is going to evolve is not true. Ultimately, what really affects change is ideas. That's why free trade came about, because intellectuals, economists, they advocated for it, and so you saw the repeal of quotas and other barriers to free trade, and that was very successful in England and other places, and it's just as true of social democracy in the 20th century. Um, People, leftists, communists, socialists, they were very persuasive in arguing in favor of social democratic reforms, um, in things like the minimum wage or socialized medicine or public education. Um, Basically, it was Fabian socialism, the idea that instead of revolutionary communism, where you overthrow the state and nationalize everything, you just sort of do it inch by inch, um, this sector by this sector, first healthcare, education, the real key command posts of the economy, infrastructure, and then slowly expanding your way out. Then you get pharmacare and nanny care, and um, before you know it, you're the French with 52% of GDP being government spending. So I think that Peterson, I think his approach here is like he's right to identify the problem, but he gives far too much credit to this notion of class struggle, which first of all, the Marxist notion of class struggle isn't even accurate. And class struggle was actually originated by two libertarian theorists, French libertarian theorists, Charles Comte and Charles Dunoyer, and their view of class struggle, which is the accurate one, which predated Marx, was that uh, with state action, you have you have winners and losers. So if a steel tariff is passed, this is going to drive up the price of steel, and it's going to benefit domestic steel producers because they can enjoy the higher prices, greater profits. But this comes at the expense of consumers who have to pay these higher prices. So that's the essence of class conflict in the libertarian sense, which is that because of state policies that favor one group or one class another, you have conflict between these two. There's no real conflict in the Marxist sense between the capitalist employer and the employee. The Marxist view is that the 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 way that profits are obtained is by the capitalist employer taking the surplus value from the employee. But the reality is that employment is a mutually beneficial arrangement. The employer values the labor of the worker more than the money that he pays him, and vice versa. The employee values the salary he gets more than what he could do in his free time if he wasn't working. So that arrangement isn't exploitative, it's mutually beneficial. It's not a conflict, it's people working harmoniously for their mutual benefit towards their various ends. And the whole concept of surplus value is fallacious. Workers tend to get paid relative to their marginal revenue value product, or how much they contribute to the productive process. So, yes, the employer gets a share as well because they're providing the capital, the organizational structure, they're taking risk, they're investing funds. Without them, the worker wouldn't be working in the first place. And and I don't see how you can say that the employer is taking advantage of the worker, because take another case, which is the worker's relationship to some random stranger, economic relationship to some random stranger in the town. Clearly, they have no relationship. It's a random stranger. So So is that person taking advantage of the worker? No, there's nothing going on there, right? It's a null scenario. So how can you say that the employer is worse than that null relationship of the worker to the stranger, um, when the worker is choosing to work for the employer, they're benefiting from the exchange, and we know they're benefiting because they keep going back to work. Um, so clearly the worker is better off, um, than if that relationship wasn't there. Ergo, they're not in conflict. There is no class conflict. They're just working harmoniously towards their mutual benefit.
Desire. So that ultimately the worst thing that can happen is for us to get what we officially desire. So I agree that human life of freedom and dignity does not consist just in searching for happiness, no matter how much we spiritualize it, or in the effort to actualize our inner potentials. We have to find some meaningful cause beyond the mere struggle for pleasurable survival. However, I would like to add here a couple of qualifications. First, since we live in a modern era, we cannot simply refer to an unquestionable authority to confer a mission or task on us. Modernity means that, yes, we should carry the burden. But the main burden is freedom itself. We are responsible for our burdens. Not only are we not allowed cheap excuses for not doing our duty, duty itself should not serve as an excuse. We are never just instruments of some higher cause. Once traditional authority loses its substantial power, it is not possible to return to it. All such returns are today a postmodern fake. Does Donald Trump stand for traditional values? No, his conservatism is a postmodern performance, a gigantic ego trip. In this sense of playing with traditional values, of mixing references to them with open obscenities, Trump is the ultimate postmodern president. If we compare Trump...
H.L. Mencken had a quote: "As democracy is perfected, the office of president represents more and more closely the inner soul of the people. On some great and glorious day, the plain folks of the land will reach their heart's desire at last, and the White House will be adorned by a downright moron."
Politician at its purest, while Sanders is rather an old-fashioned moralist. Conservative thinkers claim that the origin of our crisis is the loss of our reliance on some transcendent divinity or higher value. If we are left to ourselves, if everything is historically conditioned and relative, then there is nothing preventing us to indulge in our lowest tendencies. But is this really the lesson to be learned from mob killing, looting, and burning on behalf of religion? It is often claimed that, true or not, religion makes some otherwise bad people do good things. From today's experience, I think we should rather stick to Steve Weinberg's claim that while without religion, good people would have been doing good things and bad people bad things, only something like religion can make good people do bad things. More than a century ago, in his Brothers Karamazov, Dostoevsky warned against the dangers of godless moral nihilism. If God doesn't exist, then everything is permitted. The French philosopher André Glucksmann applied Dostoevsky's critique of godless nihilism to September 11th. And the title of his book, Dostoevsky in Manhattan, suggests, as this title suggests, he couldn't have been more wrong. The lesson of today's terrorism is that if there is a God, then everything, even blowing up hundreds of innocent bystanders, is permitted to those who claim to act directly on behalf of God. The same goes also for godless Stalinist communists. They are the ultimate proof of it. Everything was permitted to them since they perceived themselves as direct instrument of their divinity, of the historical necessity of progress towards communism. That's the big problem of ideologies. How to make good, decent people do horrible things. Second, yes, we should carry our burden, accept the suffering that goes with it. But a danger lurks here, that of a subtle reversal. Don't fall in love, that's my position, with your suffering. Never presume that your suffering is in itself a proof of your authenticity. Renunciation of pleasure can easily turn into pleasure of renunciation itself. For example, an example not from neoconservatives. White left liberals love to denigrate their own culture and blame Eurocentrism for our evils. But it is instantly clear how this self-denigration brings a profit of its own. Through this renouncing of their particular roots, multicultural liberals reserve for themselves the universal position, graciously soliciting others to assert their particular identity. White multiculturalist liberals embody the lie of identity politics. Next point. Jacques Lacan wrote but deeply true.
These guys are covering a lot of ground here. Um, I think that the question of religion and its role in shaping human history, in influencing behavior, is an important one. Um, in a lot of societies, the church has been instrumental in backing up the rule of the king. Um, that was the case in the earliest societies in ancient Sumer, in Egypt, where the clergy were tightly aligned with the king. Um, the case of Mesopotamian city-states, uh, it's been theorized that some of the earlier kings came from the clergy in times of emergency. Obviously, we don't have all the facts about what happened 7,000 years ago, but religion does have a lot to answer for. At the same time, uh, there's a lot to its credit as well. Catholicism, the role of the Catholic Church in providing a foil to national power was very instrumental in the history of Europe because you did have this transnational organization that wasn't necessarily subservient to any one king, that could play a role in geopolitics and one that was very powerful. Um, and then that led to, the Pope being kidnapped, and that conflict turned real. Um, but I mean, I'm an atheist myself, and uh, um, I don't know. I mean, is religion a net good, a net bad? I think that's something that's not very easy to quantify. Uh, that I've always sort of assumed that religion was like a noble lie, that even if it was untrue, still the moral lessons that are being taught, like don't steal, don't kill, these sort of things, um, that those are solid lessons that we should be happy, um, that they're being taught. Um, I don't think that religion is responsible for most conflict, um, geopolitically speaking. Not that it hasn't maybe been responsible for some conflict, but I think often it's a secondary reason.
something paradoxical but deeply true, that even if what a jealous husband claims about his wife, that she sleeps with other men, is all true, his jealousy is nonetheless pathological. The pathological element is the husband's need for jealousy as the only way for him to sustain his identity. Along the same lines, one could say that even if most of the Nazi claims about Jews, they exploit Germans, they seduce German girls, and so on, were true, which they were not, of course, their anti-Semitism would still be a pathological phenomenon because it ignored the true reason why the Nazis needed anti-Semitism. In the Nazi vision, their society is an organic whole of harmonious collaboration, so an external intruder is needed to account for divisions and antagonisms. The same holds for how today, in Europe at least, the anti-immigrant populists deal with the refugees. The cause of problems which are, I claim, immanent to today's global capitalism is projected onto an external intruder. Again, even if the reported incident
I think probably he means inherent or internal, not imminent. But definitely a very interesting argument. I guess I'd always assumed that the Nazis scapegoated Jews um, just because they were, their economy was in such bad shape with the reparations they had to pay and then the hyperinflation um, in the Weimar Republic. But this theory that the Nazis' vision, which was utopian, needed the other as a means of explaining why they hadn't reached this utopian state. A very very interesting theory, and I definitely see the parallel to the anti-immigration rhetoric, not just in Europe but in Canada. Uh, it's become so commonplace to blame immigrants for every problem, uh, and as Zizek says, even when there is an issue, it's still they're still being scapegoated, even if the thing happens.